debate. You're here.
All right, can I be heard clearly?
Yes, loud and clear.
All right. Four contributions from opening government. First, an explanation of why Petros is a better actor. Second, explain why it's more sustainably produced on-site opening government. Third, explain why the extraction and efficiency of extraction increases the supply of natural gas, making it cheaper on our side. And finally, an explanation as to why there are more money for the local citizens of Sarawak. First, an explanation of why Petros is a better actor. Three simple reasons. The first reason is to explain that Petros is a better actor than Petronas because Petronas is affiliated and works for the national government of Malaysia. The problem is that the ringgit is incredibly low at the moment. So there's an incentive of the national government of Malaysia and their fiscal and their central banks to actually export more oil and export more gas and natural gas, which actually harms Sarawak and that region. We think that Petronas is subject to far less of this pressure because they are not directly subject to the needs and demands of government. But second, the general stability of the Malaysian government ought be questioned in this debate. And given the fact that they have 5 prime ministers since 2018, the question you should ask yourself is, will this group Petronas have a consistent aim and goal which allows for stability on the ground in regions like Sarawak? Or will they do things like consistently change regulations? Will they do things like consistently change pricing? The third reason why Petronas, why the national group is currently ineffective, however, is that they simply aren't specialized because there are multiple regions empirically in Malaysia which produce this, which means that they have to accommodate for the different types of production, like some is onshore, some is offshore. But furthermore, we explained that they have to accommodate for other types of government interests because governments might make trade-offs, like for example, in times where they need to reduce, where, for example, they want to reduce fiscal spend, business investment, they might do less investment in things like natural gas, despite the fact that natural gas is increasing, which harms people in the regions like Sarawak. This explains why Petronas is just a bad actor. It explains why Petros is comparatively better in a series of ways. First substantive argument, explain why it's far more sustainable on side opening government. What are the claims that we're making here? First, we've proven already in our setup that it's unsustainable because the ringgit has depreciated. This is empirically true, and as a result, there are empirical efforts from the Malaysian government to actually export things. But that said, why is it far more sustainable on our house? The first reason we suggest it's more sustainable on the house is simply for the reason we flag and set, which is that when you are controlled only by a local populace who has incentives to care about the air quality, who has incentives to care about the stability of the ground or the ability for other flora and fauna to exist, they are far more likely to act in ways which keeps the sustainability of this natural gas high. And the reason this is particularly important is threefold. The first reason this is important is it actually just increases the sustainability and availability of natural gas into the long term. That is, you do not overly do it in the short term and result in long-term shortages, which make it more expensive for Malaysians in the long term. But the second reason why sustainability ought to be credited particularly highly in this debate is because of the imperative that we identify. Because we solve the issue where in these current regions, it's been particularly harmed. The second part of this sustainability argument will then be explained why Malaysia will be fine otherwise. The first reason to suggest that other Malaysian areas will be fine is we explain that they simply specialize in different areas. As there are many states in Malaysia, some of which specialize in agriculture, some of which specialize in things like machinery. So it's unlikely to have a huge impact upon each other in the way that opposition teams may suggest. The second reason why Malaysia will be fine, however, is because this creates a mechanism of competition. Because even if you do believe that Petros may act in nefarious ways, Petronas now is a competing body against it, and we suggest that the existence of these both groups at the same time is necessarily a benefit and means that people in Malaysia will be fine into the long term. This explains why first, it's more sustainably produced on our side of the house because it's controlled by a better group, but second, explains why it's important and a debate-winning contribution. Because natural gas is incredibly important to, for example, people's daily lives, such as oil and gas in general, and we ought to explain the fact that this is hugely important to keeping people's travel costs low and keeping their lives stable. Second argument, why is extraction better on the outside of the house? What is the key that we're making here? We're going to first explain that extraction is currently ineffectively done by first explaining why Petronas will never concede the 20% royalty, even if it is in their incentive to do so. The first and the simplest reason they won't do this is simply because of political pressure. There are 12 other states in Malaysia. They will not concede the government giving more of their revenue towards one single state, which means that even if it is an incentive for the national body to actually allow the 20% royalty, they will never do it. And this explains why it is necessary for this form of actions to be taken. Because opposition needs to explain why all 12 states suddenly stop putting this pressure and why they should have less taxpayer dollars going towards them. Second reason we explain how is that there are just ideological stances that exist currently in Malaysian politics. The fact that Malaysian politics currently is incredibly radicalized by certain parties means there are relatively hardcore views which necessarily prevent this from rising. That explains why they will never concede the 20%. What is the second claim that we're going to make under this argument? The second thing we're going to explain is prove why demand for these things is inelastic. This is important because if you believe it's inelastic, it's unlikely to cause an huge extent of harm on either side. First reason it's inelastic. People just need it. Like, Malaysia does not have a huge amount of renewable energy given how expensive it is. That means people still rely upon more traditional forms of energy like oil and gas, as indicated in the info slide. This suggests to you that there is a relatively inelastic demand for these types of resources. The second reason, however, why the demand is relatively inelastic is simply because you cannot store these resources particularly well. Like, for example, oil and natural gas are incredibly volatile and require fast usage, which explains why the demand is unlikely to be inelastic. Because this demand is inelastic, this explains a few key ideas in this debate. This explains why there is less production on our side, because for two key reasons. First, there's less production on our side because Sarawak produces less if they receive less of a royalty. That is, if you receive only 5%, you're obviously going to scale down the extent of your production, which is necessarily harmful. The second reason why it's reduced, however, is because they have less funds to reinvest into improving the efficiency of their own production, because producing oil and natural gas is actually quite expensive, especially when you are tapping into new reserves. Like, you need to do geographical surveys, you need to blow things up. Those are resources which, if they don't receive the 20% royalty or higher, as we suggest would currently exist, that is unlike that means they have less efficient equipment and therefore less efficient extraction, reducing the supply overall that's available. All this means is currently, because we have proven that demand is inelastic, but there is a reduced supply at the moment, this drives the price upwards of natural gas, which makes it less accessible to everyone in Malaysia and everyone in that area. That said, final part of this argument, why does Sarawak actually concede 20% or even higher, noting we are willing to defend obviously a higher thing? First, is empirically true. That is what they are bargaining for. That is what they are pushing for. But second, they are obviously pushing because they have more electoral pressures. And the opposition may prove that it's not maybe 20%, but 15%. But obviously, let's be comparative in this debate. 15% versus 5% is obviously still a win for opening government. At the end of this argument, what should you believe? Currently, there are supply issues because they can't produce efficiently, but demand is inelastic. This drives the price up. This is a problem that we solve not only because we have better equipment, but also because we unlock the incentive to actually mine things efficiently. Final claim in this debate, we get more money for the people of Sarawak. This is relatively simple and downstream. It explains simply that when more oil and gas is produced in these regions, you simply have more workers, you have more funding for these people. And given that a lot of people in Sarawak are still poor, despite the fact that the region is quite rich, a lot of these people are exploited currently. This explains why it's better. This is comparative because the national government has less incentive to listen to a small state, whereas the state government has a far higher incentive to listen to their worker needs. It's never been proud to govern.
We thank Prime Minister for their fine speech. Now to continue, Leader of Opposition. Here.
Cool. For POIs, please put them in the chat or visually. Just please do not unmute. Two observations before I get into substantive. First, Petros still exists on our side of the house. We think that it is still established at the point where it exists right now, and Sarawak really wants it to, so that they can have more leverage over the national government, so that they can have it as a potential alternative. That means that on our side of the house, it's not completely taking over the oil and gas industry in the state, but it still exists and still could have partial ownership like it has in the past. The reason that we think that this is significant is because it means that you can actually have some level of competition between the two at the point where they both exist in the state. We think that'll flip a lot of the claims that we get out of OG. More on that in a moment. But the second thing I want to note is that Sarawak still has bargaining power in negotiations with the national government on our side of the house, which means that they are likely to be able to do things like succeed in getting an increase in the royalties. We think that this is the case because it's mutually beneficial to both Malaysia, who wants to keep Sarawak happy, to prevent them from doing something like letting their own state entity take over all of the production, but also, and Sarawak obviously wants to push for this so that they get higher royalties. They just say that this is not going to look good to the other states, but I think that at the point where they can frame it as the alternative is Petros getting complete control over oil and gas in the state, they can make this look appealing to the other states, they can justify an increase in the royalties, so we think that this claim from OG is probably just false. But with that, first substantive from OO, we think that why we think that oil production is just going to get a lot worse on Gov. The first thing I want to characterize here is that oil production is just very capital intensive, as OG concedes. It requires increasingly more exploration in order to find new deposits, both onshore and offshore. It also just, as the more obvious deposits get depleted, requires things like drilling deeper and deeper and having more high technology equipment in order to be able to extract. Why do we think that you just have less capital for extraction on their side of the house? Firstly, because you have less competition. Because when both Petros and Petronas exist, and both exist in Sarawak, we think that you are able to force innovation at the point where they both want to improve. We also just think that you have competition on a global scale. But secondly, more importantly, we think that the Malaysian government is going to give money to Petronas at the point where they benefit from the oil extraction that it's doing. So when the Malaysian government benefits, you're just able to get money from a much larger base. They just have a lot more money than a single state at the point where they have the entire tax base and they have more capital that you can invest. Thirdly, Petronas is just a larger company and therefore has more capital of its own to invest at the point where it has existed for a lot longer and it has operations all around the world and all throughout Malaysia. It has more of its own money and equipment that it can use when doing things like extracting oil in Sarawak. And the last thing to note is that we just think that management is better because Petronas is better able to attract workers from elsewhere. It has a bigger global presence. It has more talent network, etc. It's just able to get better people on its team to do things like innovate better technology and has better relationships with other countries and oil companies around the world. We think that it is just better positioned to do this extraction in a good way. What is the impact of this then? We think that on our side of the house, you just have more money and talent for the actual extraction of oil at the point where we think that Petronas is just better able to tap into these capital bases on our side of the house. Why does this outweigh the mechanism that we get from OG? Because they say that extraction is better on their side of the house, but we think that on either side there exists the incentive to expand extraction. Even if Sarawak isn't getting the complete profits, at the point where they do get a share of it, they have they have the incentive to increase production. Also, Petronas clearly has the incentive to increase production. Our mechanisms, though, uniquely explain why we have better capacity to actually improve extraction on our side of the house at the point where you just have more capital to tap into, where you have a better market, where Petronas has control over these oil reserves. But before that, I'll take a POI from closing.
Yeah. Wouldn't the incentive of Petronas be to make sure that people in Sarawak are still poor so they can benefit from low cost of labor when extracting oil from that region?
No, we don't think that it's good for Petronas, for the people in the region to be super poor. We think that it is probably better for them if this region is getting more investment, for example, so that they're more likely to just have a more stable and better economy and have a better country as a whole. We also think that at the point where they're controlled by the Malaysian government, who has incentives for people all throughout Malaysia to be in good economic conditions, this mechanism also falls. I think that's a pretty stupid point. Cool. Second thing to talk about, why do we think we actually improve the economy in Sarawak? Because the core claim here is that we think that diversification is on net better for Sarawak's economy, and we get more diversification on our side of the house where Petros does not have complete control over the oil and gas industry. Why is this true? Because we think that when Petros has complete control and gets all of the revenues in Sarawak, it is going to crowd out other industry in the state and preventing it from diversifying into other economic areas in the long run. Why? I think firstly, it is just going to drain capital. It can do things like offer bonds so that investors who want to invest into this region can buy the company bonds. What this means is that it directly trades off with investment in other industries in the area. It comes at the expense of investing in other businesses or buying bonds from other businesses at the point where everyone interested in investing in the state is going to be investing in Petros. But secondly, we think that is also going to drain talent because we think that Petros is overwhelmingly likely to hire within the region. While this might sound good, it means that you have less human capital for other industries at the point where it is crowding out those other industries industries, it is outcompeting them, etc. But we think that in contrast, Petronas is more likely to hire a mix of people from outside the state and inside the state. Obviously, they're going to hire some people from Sarawak, but not to an extent that is going to harm other industries in the same way. All of this is to say that we think that when Petros has so much power in Sarawak, it is likely to crowd out other industries in an incredibly harmful way. What are the impacts of this? We think that diversifying the economy and having the economy more spread out between sectors is crucial to prevent over-reliance on oil and gas. We think that when Petros has complete control, Sarawak is just going to be way too reliant. That means that if things happen like the oil runs out or there are global price shocks and the price of oil goes down, their economy is going to be utterly and completely fucked at the point where they don't have reliable alternatives. We think that in contrast, on our side of the house, you just have a stronger economy. Diversification boosts productivity and means you have more skilled workers in a variety of sectors and are a lot more resilient to shocks. The last thing I want to say is that we think that it's also just worse for the Malaysian economy as a whole when Petros has this complete control, because we think that the fact that they're able to redistribute the revenues from oil and gas is good on our side of the house. It can go, for example, to places in West Malaysia that have less access to natural resources. We think that it is better if all of these places can partially benefit from the revenues of oil and gas while also still having incentives to diversify their own economies and invest in other industries. We think that it's better for Malaysia as a whole if all of this states have this sort of diversification, and I think Tejas can expand on this. But all of this is to say that we think Petros having complete control would be really bad for oil production and for the economy of both Sarawak and Malaysia as a whole. Very proud to stand on OO.
We thank Leader of Opposition for their fine speech. Now to continue, DPM. Here.
Hey, just checking I can be heard.
Yes.
Perfect. Give me 1 second. Firstly on Sarawak and then on the rest of Malaysia. Our main claim is that when you no longer allow Sarawak and you no longer allow Petros to engage in all of the oil production in their local economy, you are less likely to be able to get large-scale extraction of oil. And all of the opening opposition analysis for why it is the case that Sarawak's economy is likely to be harmed as a result of this is not only disproven when they immediately concede that you do in fact get less production, because they say things like, well, we don't want Petros and we don't want oil production to crowd out other industries. We don't want it to crowd out labor. We don't want it to crowd out investment, etc., which directly concedes that you must do less production in Sarawak if this is all going to be true. But importantly, we explain that, as is indicated by the clarifications, if it is true that Sarawak controls the wells and the actual areas in which that oil is extracted from, then you need for Petronas and Sarawak to agree and enter into contracts in order for that production to happen under side opening opposition. We provide a set of layers which receive extraordinarily poor response for why that agreement would never happen. We explain that empirically, Sarawak has continued to make the demand for a 20% royalty, which we explain that Petronas is one, structurally unable to make because the 20% royalty is extraordinarily large. And the reason that Sarawak wants to increase the royalty disproportionately is just because they have no control over they have less control over where the general money goes when it's given back to the central Malaysian government, but also because there are political reasons that you can't concede on this promise. Politicians that, even if it was in their incentive to agree to this promise and to ensure that Petronas can keep extracting oil in their local area, cannot step back because people in Sarawak are angry at the fact that there has been oil and gas extraction in their territory for an extremely long time and feels like the central Malaysian government is making them cop the environmental harm and them cop the suffering that comes as a result of that without seeing any of the benefits, which is why even if it was rational, politicians politicians cannot back down from this promise because it would seem weak and because it would seem like they're being bullied by the national government, which is the reason you're never going to enter into these contracts with Petronas, which is bad because we explained that the next opportunity for natural gas exploitation is incredibly more expensive. When the amount of natural gas options you have to extract decreases, the fact that you have to go to a worse opportunity, which is deeper, which has more complicated steps that are needed to go and extract it, that might be on more expensive land, significantly increases the cost of extracting that. And all of their weighing about why this is capital intensive explains why if you increase the cost of extraction, this is a harm which is passed on directly to consumers. Their only response is to suggest that, Petros can still exist in their side and can still engage in production. The problem with this analysis is that, one, it is at tension with their second argument, which explains that Petros itself must shrink because they say that they don't want Petros to offer bonds, because they say that they don't want Petros to offer labor, because they say they don't want Petros to crowd out other businesses. But importantly, is unlikely to succeed because all of their analysis about why Petronas is on far larger scale literally proves why it is the case that unless Petros is able to control all natural gas productions within the region of Sarawak, they're unlikely to ever be a meaningful form of competition against Petronas, which means you would end up in a situation where Petros cannot afford to economically viably extract natural gas in Sarawak, but at the same time, Petronas is not able to enter an agreement, which is where all of our harms unfold. It is where the case that you do not get cheaper natural gas on the market and people have to spend more to engage in their businesses and they have to spend more money to get to work, which is incredibly harmful. I'm going to deal quickly with their analysis for why the Sarawak economy suffers, though. They have three claims. First of all, they say that you crowd out investors. Secondly, that you crowd out labor. Third of all, that you crowd out in general. We would point out that obviously a crowding out argument does not work because you cannot simply buy more petrol instead of buying like food or other productions. So the classical crowding out argument wouldn't work. The reason that none of their other arguments work is because obviously investment happens on a cross-border basis. That is that Petros could just sell bonds to investors that are not from Sarawak. And if they can't, they don't explain why Petronas can't sell bonds for individual infrastructure projects in Sarawak to anyone except people in Sarawak. So they don't explain why crowding out wouldn't happen on their side. But even if these arguments made sense, one, it concedes less production. The reason that argument is more important is because it's bad not only for the people of Sarawak, but also because it's bad for the entire international natural gas market. But secondly, and more importantly, we would explain that when you have more production in the immediacy, even if it did come at the opportunity costs of investment into other industries, that is more revenue for the Sarawak government, which is far more likely to be well equipped to do things like directed strategic investment into other industries, which are in fact viable, instead of money from investors who do probably come from other parts of Malaysia or perhaps even other countries, given that Malaysia has a fairly open capital economy. It is just likely to go outside of Sarawak into opportunities which are far more efficient, which explains why, if you care about people on the ground in Sarawak, you should believe our claim. The important thing to note as well is that their weighing on people outside of Sarawak and why they matter is directly dealt with by our claim, that the people in Sarawak in the status quo do not have leverage to ensure the Petronas is not causing damage, because when extraction is done by a company which is directly linked to the Sarawak government, where the people have an entire control over what that company does, as opposed to a small control on the Malaysian government, even if it is still somewhat, that is when the company is more likely to take risks. That is when the company is less scared of voter backlash because there is a far longer width between that, which is just why you are more likely to see more careless drilling practices. You are far more likely to get things like natural gas spills and explosions in Sarawak because Petronas has a weaker incentive. And obviously, we're not saying that they're going to be totally careless, but our claim is that natural gas exploitation is hard, and so marginal differences in the amount that you care and the amount of expensive safety steps you take is incredibly important. Before I explain market competition, does closing have anything? Opening.
Point. The ringgit is literally in a 2-year high. What the fuck are you talking about when you talk about ringgit depreciation?
I don't know. That's just what Kevin said. I don't know if it's that important. Secondly, on market competition, we would explain that in the status quo, there's low amounts of natural gas competition within Malaysia and with generally for two reasons. First of all, Petronas experiences a natural monopoly, which is to suggest that it controls all of the distribution networks in Malaysia, as is indicated by the info slide, but also the fact it has easier access to all those distribution networks, which explains why it has a natural predisposition to be advantaged within that economy. But second of all, we would explain it has an enforced monopoly in the status quo, because the government has an incentive to restrict new entrants into the market, because it would obviously increase operational costs for Petronas, but also because which could be used to increase Petronas' advantage on the export level, which we explained this Malaysian government cares a lot about, which is just to suggest that in the status quo, there's no effective competitor for Petronas. We would note that in a world where natural gas is becoming more important, Petros must control, importantly, all of natural gas in Sarawak to be an effective competitor and to compete on price, because we would suggest it is only then it can even attempt to reach a sufficient scale to not suffer from the lack of economies of scale that would make it uncompetitive with Petronas. To actually be sufficiently close to engage in effective distribution, but also to have the bargaining power to, for instance, encourage the Malaysian government to allow it to set up distribution networks in other Malaysian states. But even if you do not believe that, the fact that Petros would now be able to export to the local competitors who would otherwise be subject to the natural monopoly of Petronas, this is incredibly important for reducing competition. Because if you believe our claim earlier about why it is inelastic, then the ability for Petronas to exist in a monopoly as it does in a status quo is incredibly important, and marginal increases in competition have huge benefits. The reason that Petros cannot compete in the status quo is just because without total control, Petronas will always be unit per unit cheaper, which is why they'll get access to the exploitation opportunities that are necessary for the people of Sarawak, but also for everyone else who needs natural gas outside opening government.
Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Thank the LO for that fine speech. Now for the closing houses, may I invite member of government? You're here.
Awesome. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, loud and clear.
Cool. So obviously there are poorer regions in Malaysia than Sarawak, but I think for some structural reasons I'll explain, there are incentives for the national providers and not sort of give them their due, right? I think Sarawak, obviously the thing I brought up to Leader of Opposition on POI, if you're the national provider, you often want these kinds of regions which produce a lot of raw resources, but don't necessarily have other kinds of industries to remain poor, because it means that you don't have to pay people who are doing otherwise quite dangerous jobs. Oil drilling and oil extraction has like very high rates of fatality and injury. So if these people are poor, you can keep those costs down and then nationally benefit from the sort of low price of oil. There's other structural reasons why I think the national provider doesn't necessarily want to see Sarawak grow and Sarawak develop, is that obviously the political capital of Malaysia is on the mainland, and that's where a majority of the richest people in the country live. That's where the politicians are most proximate. That's where, they're living, they're privately spending their money. It's also the case that mainland is more proximate to the rest of Southeast Asia, so they benefit historically from easier migration and trade with the other surrounding states, many of which are richer than Malaysia proportionally. So that's why I think there's likely, and I'd assume this is probably empirically true, a significant wealth divide between the sort of richer regions in the west of Malaysia and the somewhat poorer regions in the east, which includes Sarawak. But I think a lot of the benefits we're going to show in developing this region in particular probably also spill over to the surrounding regions, and then can co-opt a lot of the impacting Tejas did at the end of DLO. Already explained the price stuff, yeah. So this is probably why Sarawak is considering trying to nationalize this in the first place. Obviously, this isn't something you do for no reason. So they must be unhappy with how the oil is being sort of partitioned, how the profits are being sectioned, where that oil is being sold off, and other kinds of agreements. Let's explain then why Petros is more likely to privilege the domestic industry of Sarawak as a province, why that's incredibly good. So if you're looking at where you want to sell your oil, some of which you may want to sell like internationally to higher bidders than Petronas might otherwise choose to, because they want to privilege domestic manufacturing in other parts of Malaysia, probably other sort of richer parts, because that benefits the national government who want a strong national economy, but not necessarily a small regional economy in each of the constituent states. But also, again, for the reason that you want the region to continue to have poor labor. So if there's burgeoning business that drive up, higher cost of goods and higher housing markets, which mean you have to pay people more money for them to do jobs, it means you have to pay the oil workers higher. That means cost of living goes up in that region. So overall, there's a disincentive for the national industry to develop this. But if it's run by the state government, obviously they care about the well-being of their state, even if they are somewhat corrupt. I think that's only true up to a point. Obviously, you want the place where you live and the people who are culturally similar to you to prosper. So I think obviously there's going to be incentive for you to cut preferential deals with regional Sarawak businesses for their energy costs, try and, put in price controls for the price of oil for local people, secure better bargaining internationally than otherwise Malaysia might ask, selling Sarawak oil to their own domestic regions, to ensure that you're making as much money off of this industry as possible. And the profits that the Sarawak oil is making, Petros, is being reinvested and recaptured within the state. I think we've sufficiently then explained why the shift in oil production will result in more domestic development of the local Sarawak economy as a whole. Let's explain why this is very, very good. The first reason is on the production of infrastructure to facilitate the sort of growth of Petros and stuff, right? So if you as a state want to invest this oil money, right? It requires the building and requires you having the capital in order to build, and you'll have more money, especially the businesses which are going to spur out as a result of things like price control and more accessible energy within the state of Sarawak. This means you're producing things like electrical grids, roads, bridges, right? All of this kind of wonderful stuff. But then once that infrastructure is built, regular people simply benefit who might have had nothing to do with the deal that Sarawak cut initially with whatever business that they were subsidizing, right? People can just use the roads which now exist as opposed to didn't exist. Schools benefit from being on the electrical grid that now exists, which otherwise might not have existed or might have been substantially more expensive, right? So that makes goods cheaper because it's easier and more fluid to get them there. That brings down the cost of food for other people. It means it's easier for other people to open a business. It means surrounding regions have more traffic moving through and from them. So I think these benefits spill out of Sarawak because right, once there's like wealthier people within the Sarawak region, they go over to the neighboring state, which is maybe proportionally cheaper in order to buy things or go on vacation, and then they spend money there. That uplifts the entire sort of eastern region of Malaysia. And I think these downstream benefits are incredibly good for the people living there. Before I secondly explain impact on foreign investment, I'd love to hear from Closing. Have they even given a POI yet? Closing, are you guys even in the call? No? Okay, cool. Well, that's going to be a problem in about 2 minutes. Let's go in then next to investment. So I think independent of whether or not Petros even actually does a lot of the localized investment we're talking about. This is an independent reason. I think there's perceptually a significant reason for people to want to benefit from what they perceive to be likely, increased new subsidies of the region, right? If you're like an investor and you see this on the news, you probably go, wow, Sarawak is like regionalizing their sort of production of oil. Wow, there's probably going to be a significant jump in the income of this region. There's probably going to be new business opportunities. So that encourages you to put up the capital in order to invest in this region, and probably locally within Malaysia as well. So this means that there's an initial shock of positive capital, which means just another reason a lot of this infrastructure and a lot of this economic development is going to happen. But the last part of this argument we need to win and take it over the front half is to explain why developing Sarawak is objectively good in an objective sense. I think the reason is that it manages to co-opt all of opening ops push on like harms to the rest of the economy. I think this is somewhat understated given there are other sources in Malaysia for oil. So the richer parts are probably still going to have their energy prices needed. But what I think we need is a development in the more poorer region, which I explained structurally Sarawak is likely located in, and that is going to uplift poor people who are largely like the primary beneficiaries of infrastructure and other types of regions. You literally just have schools and roads where there otherwise might not have been there before. That's an enormous impact that I think is much less speculative than a lot of what front half has told you.
We thank member of government for their fine speech. Now to continue, member of opposition. Here.
Hi,
Okay. If I give each of my 5 states $100 million, neither of them are able to afford to buy an oil drill. If I give one state $500 million, then it can afford to buy one. Now, this illustration isn't perfect because Petronas does control where you drill oil. But what Petronas doesn't necessarily control is things like building electrical lines or roads that are necessary to distribute this oil and allow it to be profitable, like for the state that it is in. So this is to say, even if Petronas can afford to prioritize developing oil sector in certain areas, this prioritization isn't sufficient to generate wealth in these places because the state itself that it is developing in isn't able to build the infrastructure to support this growth. Now, the reason why Petronas has to distribute these things equally is because it is liable to the entire country. Petros is different. Petros is only liable to Sarawak State. So therefore, when Sarawak State wants to develop, say, the oil sector significantly more, it is able to just reinvest as much wealth as necessary to most efficiently develop the roads and infrastructure necessary to build things. This is beating OG because they're not comparative. So I'm not told why OG is able to generate additional wealth. They're just able to explain to us why Sarawak State is still able to generate some additional wealth, maybe for themselves. And I'm not sure why we should prioritize Sarawak over Malaysia. I think this is also something Diggory better explains. I'll take Tejas.
Yeah, Petronas and other state-owned enterprises are still profit maximizing. So if it's unprofitable for them to distribute equally, they won't. But Malaysia has tons of infrastructure to distribute equally, tons of infrastructure to export. I do not understand your extension.
No, Malaysia doesn't have tons of infrastructure to distribute equally. If we want just to like assert battle, we can also do that. But like, if you think about it, there's a bunch of different issues in Malaysia that prevent it from being able to distribute equally. First off, a lot of Malaysia is just like islands, right? Which is to say, you can't just necessarily build bridges to allow things to distribute like this. So yeah, I think my illustrations are beating you here. But secondly, to address the more important part of this POI, it is just to say Petronas is still like able to prioritize development in places it wants to prioritize. I just explained why this isn't true. Petronas has limited control over whether or not locations with plenty of oil are best suited to actually extract this oil. So when you allow places to become independent, then you actually allow this extraction to occur. So I think this is the way we're able to win in this round. Why is this important? Well, I think when you compare it then, there is Petronas, who is able to extract less oil overall, generate less oil overall, and then there's Petronas plus Petros, which is able to extract more oil overall. And even if this oil is only like useful for certain, like a smaller group of people, or the wealth only accrues to a smaller group of people, this is still fine because we're able to explain to you why this group of people matters. That's another thing that OG is missing in this round. So why is that these people matter? We give you two reasons. First off, Sarawak people had prior entitlement to this land compared to mainland Malaysia. The state is of indigenous communities who in a pretty big way were at some point colonized by mainland Malaysia. This is quite important because these people are probably entitled to the land, even if you don't believe people should be entitled to land. They have a prior entitlement to this land compared to the rest of Malaysia. The second reason we give you is just that Sarawak is generally poorer than mainland Malaysia and would benefit more from things when they were actually built there. So there's like diminishing returns to just kind of spreading the wealth very, very thinly, giving very little money to a state. Whereas if you allow Sarawak itself a very, very large sum of income, it does two things. One, it massively increases the actual quality of living, so you have more substantial differences. But secondly, it attracts FDI. So actually addressing what Tejas said, connections matter immensely. It's difficult to establish connections with Shell and Exxon. I think this is kind of dumb. Companies like to work with locations that are developing the quickest. So if Petros all of a sudden has unilateral control over Sarawak State oil, then Shell and Exxon would love to get first mover advantage to get access to these markets. Anyway, I'm going to talk more about opening opposition now because I think they're the only team that kind of has a chance in this round. First, they say oil production is capital intensive, so it requires increasingly like more exploration to find deposits, and they say that the Malaysian government is better at doing these things. And I kind of just explained why it isn't, because even if the Malaysian government is better at doing these things in the status quo, it is bound by too many restrictions that say not all of the wealth can be reinvested to extracting oil. A lot of this wealth must be invested into other states, etc. And it can't like prioritize the speed of these investments at a pace which would actually generate maximal wealth. Also, there's just very limited delta because oil exists in other parts of Malaysia in very, very large quantities as well. Like literally in Sarawak State, it's only like 20-something% of the oil. In mainland Malaysia, you have the other 80%. So like, I don't know how this case actually works. Secondly, they say this will prevent Sarawak from diversifying into other industries in the future. Diversifying is a very long-term impact. Like global price shocks and oil running out aren't going to happen for quite a while, or at least if like oil's as inelastic as OG will have us believe. Sarawak can only diversify once they have the money to do so, which is to say, once you make a lot of money, Sarawak has control with what you do with this type of stuff, right? Which is to say, they can now reinvest this money to other types of portfolios like what Norway did in order to actually successfully diversify. I think this is just an argument about whether you're smart about things, not whether or not you're going to be successful. Third, Sarawak is one of the wealthiest states in Malaysia. Tejas says the difference between Sarawak and Kuala Lumpur isn't done justice just by saying Sarawak ranks in the top 10. It's plenty poorer than the rest of Malaysia due to wealth concentration you often see in developing countries. Sarawak also has high wealth inequality. So there's a lot of people in Sarawak who would benefit from the additional wealth that is coming to them. I think I framed this in order to be like structurally true as well, given that there's a lot of indigenous communities within Sarawak Sarawak. Last but not least, Tejas says Sarawak state is corrupt. This is just untrue, as much as I'd love to believe things just because Tejas told me so. Sarawak has some of the greatest diversity amongst domestic needs, amongst its dozens of diverse indigenous communities, and even though there is wealth inequality, the wealth inequality pools into different political incentives. So I structurally prove to you, but I also just kind of counter assert, and I think this is just a fair thing to do in debate. Like, nobody knows what exactly is going on in Sarawak politics. The local politics aren't something that happen in global headlines in the first place. Now let's talk about OG, and I'm gonna have two things I want to talk about them. First is their response to OO. They just say Malaysia is going to be fine in the long term because Malaysia specializes in different things and it creates competition. These are mitigatory. First, I already told you that most oil in Malaysia doesn't come from Sarawak. There's like double amount the oil in like Sabah or something. And like this is just better mitigation given it shows that most of the oil isn't actually dependent on Sarawak. So therefore the types of harms are much more clearly impacted here to be limited. Secondly, if Sarawak is actually vocal about these plans, which it seems like it is, then mainland Malaysia won't be left so volatile anyway because mainland Malaysia is like fully aware that there's this like seceding part of the oil department. They're able to plan for these things. Last but not least, I already kind of highlighted the other issue with OG. It's just that they're missing the comparative analysis we give. CO dropped a bunch of spec. They're only 1.5 Chinese, which suggests they're only 0.5 Malaysian. I'm 100% Malaysian because the YouTube channels I secretly binge are 100% Malaysian. But also, they say like Sarawak secessionist sentiments kind of matter. Like this is kind of the only non-derivative thing they bring up. If you deny something Sarawak clearly wants, then they're more likely to secede, which is to say, CO strangely kind of proves the opposite thing because you make the entirety of Sarawak kind of upset that they don't get control over their own resources. So they have to bite their own impact there. I think CG is the one who's winning this round. Thank you very much.
We thank Gufford for that fine speech. Now to close off the debate, I'll Buet here.